I grew up in a house where silence was louder than words. Every tick of the clock echoed like a reminder that time itself was being judged by him. My father had a strange way of loving. He said perfection was love's highest form, that discipline was proof of care. I believed him, because when you're young, you don't know any better. You take what's given, even if it hurts. The house always smelled of polish and aftershave. Everything was in its place. The glass ashtray on the center table, the neatly folded newspaper, the row of shoes lined up like soldiers by the door. Even the curtains hung with military precision, the folds pressed into obedience. My mother used to say, "Your father likes things done right." But the way she said it carried a tremor, a hint of something that didn't fit the neatness of the room. He had a gaze that could stop you mid-step. I remember being 8 when I first learned what that look meant, the quiet threat behind his calm eyes. He didn't need to shout. His silence was a weapon sharper than words. He'd sit there, hands folded, and say, "Do you call this effort? Look at you. How do you expect to grow if you can't even get the small things right?" That was his version of encouragement. I tried hard. I really did. Every report card, every drawing, every chore, I wanted to see that look of approval, but approval from him was like sunlight in winter. It touched you for a second and then vanished, leaving a cold shadow behind. When I did something right, he'd nod once, maybe mutter, "Better." When I failed, his face would harden like glass. Once, when I was 10, I spilled milk on the dining table during breakfast. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood up slowly, took a cloth, and cleaned it himself. But the quiet after that was unbearable. He didn't talk to me for 3 days. My mother tried to ease the tension, but her eyes carried the same fear. It wasn't about the milk, it was about failure. Every mistake felt like a crack in his perfect world. There were moments when he seemed almost kind. He'd teach me how to polish my shoes, tie my tie, or comb my hair before school. His hands were rough but steady. He'd say, "A man is measured by the details." And for a moment, I'd feel proud, useful, seen. But those moments never lasted. They were like fragments of warmth that disappeared the moment something went wrong. By 12, I began to live inside my head more than in that house. I'd stare at the wallpaper in my room, faded patterns of blue and beige, and imagine cracks forming behind it, like the walls themselves were tired of pretending. I started to hear my father's footsteps differently, not as the sound of someone coming home, but as the warning before silence fell again. He wasn't violent in the usual sense. His punishments weren't about pain, but about control. When I disobeyed or failed a task, he'd make me redo it again and again until it was flawless. Sometimes I'd stay up past midnight rewriting a single paragraph from a school essay because he'd said the handwriting was careless. I remember my fingers cramping, the pen digging into my skin, the smell of ink mixing with exhaustion, but I kept writing because I wanted him to be proud. Perfection became the only language we shared. There was one night, around Christmas, maybe '89, when he came home late. He'd been drinking, which was rare for him. I was sitting by the fire pretending to read. The lights were dim, the room golden and quiet. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "You remind me of myself." There was no pride in his voice. It sounded like a warning. He said, "You have my habits, my face, my weakness for excuses. You better fix that before it ruins you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. That was what I always did. Nod, obey, stay small. I used to think love was supposed to make you better, but in our house, love made you afraid to fail. My mother would sometimes whisper, "He means well," while she ironed his shirts, her eyes fixed on the faint steam rising from the fabric. I think she believed it. Maybe I did too for a while. But as I got older, I began to notice the cracks. The way her hands trembled when he entered the room, the way his voice lowered, not out of gentleness because anger, when quiet, had more power. The way I'd start checking my reflection before speaking to make sure my face didn't look too defensive. When I turned 14, he gave me a watch for my birthday, a silver one, engraved with the words, "Make every second count." I wore it every day, though the ticking started to feel like a countdown, each second a reminder of how little time there was to prove myself. That night,
After everyone slept, I sat by the window and listened to the sound of rain hitting the glass. I thought about how strange it was to live in a house where everything looked perfect from the outside. The neighbors would smile, say, "Your father's such a respectable man." And I'd smile back, knowing they'd never see what respect cost behind closed doors. Perfection, I realized, wasn't about doing your best. It was about erasing who you really were until all that was left was what someone else wanted to see. And I was disappearing, piece by piece.
There's a strange kind of numbness that comes from living under constant correction. You stop trying to please and start trying not to fail. I don't remember when that shift happened for me, maybe somewhere between 13 and 15. What I do remember is how my father's expectations started to fill every corner of our lives like invisible smoke. You could feel it even when he wasn't there. By then, my mother had stopped defending me. She still smiled at breakfast, still ironed his shirts, still called me sweetheart when he wasn't around. But her eyes would silently warn me whenever I was close to doing something that might set him off. She had learned to live within the boundaries of his moods, and I followed. Everything became a test. If I folded my clothes wrong, he'd unfold them and make me start again. Neatness is respect. If I left a dish unwashed, he'd place it back in front of me and say, "You eat with those hands. Make 'em worthy." But it was never about chores. It was about control. A silent ritual that reminded us that we existed under his watch even when he wasn't watching. There were good days, too. That's what made it so confusing. Some Sundays, he'd take me fishing or to the old hardware store on the edge of town. He'd talk about how men build things, how strength wasn't about emotion, but endurance. I'd nod along, trying to match his pace, memorizing every word as if understanding him would somehow save me. He had this way of talking about life like it was a competition, one I was already losing. "You're too soft," he'd say. "The world eats soft men." And then softer, almost regretfully, "You'll thank me one day." I didn't.
Around 16, I started keeping a small journal. Not a diary exactly, just a notebook where I wrote words I couldn't say aloud. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes just sentences like, "I am tired of being careful," or "He doesn't see me, only the mistakes I make." I hid it under the loose floorboard beneath my bed, the same way other boys my age hid magazines. For me, the secret wasn't desire, it was survival. One evening, I came home late from school. It wasn't rebellion. I had stayed to help a teacher pack up art supplies. But when I opened the door, I knew immediately something was wrong. The living room lights were dim. My mother sat stiffly on the couch, eyes red. And my father, he held my notebook in his hand. I still remember how cold my legs felt. "Is this yours?" he asked. His voice was calm. That was worse than shouting. I couldn't speak. He flipped through the pages slowly, reading fragments aloud. "He doesn't see me. I am tired of being careful." He looked up at me, eyes narrowing. "Do you think this is a game? Writing nonsense about your family like we're some kind of strangers?" I stammered. "It was just thoughts, Dad. Thoughts. You think you have the right to think that way?" He threw the notebook on the floor, and for a moment I thought he might hit me, but he didn't. He just pointed toward it and said, "Pick it up. Read it. Out loud." My throat tightened. I wanted to disappear. My mother whispered, "Please, just let it go." But he didn't move. So I read it. Every word. My voice trembled, cracking somewhere around the part that said, "I wish I could be enough without being perfect." He stood there, silent, and then said, "You sound weak." That night, I tore the notebook to pieces after he went to bed. I flushed the pages down the toilet one handful at a time. Watching those words vanish into the water felt like erasing a part of myself. But that was the lesson, wasn't it? In our house, you learn to delete the parts that didn't fit his version of perfect. After that, I stopped writing. I stopped drawing too. My grades improved, my posture straightened, and I learned how to answer him with precision. Yes, Father. No, Father. My voice became flat, disciplined, mechanical. I became what he wanted, at least on the outside. But the strange thing about control is that it breeds ghosts. Sometimes in the quiet moments, I'd hear my own thoughts whispering in rebellion, like a secret rhythm under the silence. When he'd lecture me about discipline shaping destiny, I'd nod, but inside I'd think, discipline is just fear dressed in uniform. I never said it out loud. I wouldn't have dared. But that thought kept me alive. One night, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I was standing straight, my hair combed, my shirt tucked perfectly, but the boy staring back at me looked hollow. His eyes had the same cautious stillness as my father's. That terrified me more than anything. That was when I realized I wasn't trying to become like him. I already was. The next morning, I woke up early. I could hear him shaving in the bathroom, the faint scrape of metal against skin. I stood outside the door for a moment, listening to that steady, rhythmic sound. It reminded me of time passing, of years shaved down to silence. I wanted to say something, to tell him I wasn't angry, that I just wanted to be seen, but I didn't. Words meant risk, and risk meant punishment. So I went downstairs instead, poured coffee for him the way he liked it, 2 sugars, no milk, and waited. He came down, nodded at the cup, then looked at me. Good, you're finally learning. I smiled, or tried to. Inside, something broke, quietly, like a branch snapping under snow. That was the day I stopped trying to win his approval, not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. I realized perfection wasn't love. It was a cage built from fear and decorated with rules. And the more I obeyed, the smaller I became.
It's strange how silence can grow louder over time. By 17, our house was quiet in a way that felt permanent. We didn't argue anymore, not because we'd found peace, but because we'd both learned our roles. He gave orders, I followed. My mother pretended not to notice the distance stretching between us like a crack in the floorboards. School became my escape, not because I loved it, but because it wasn't home. The halls buzzed with noise, laughter, the kind of careless energy that terrified my father. He used to say, noise is a sign of undiscipline. I think that's why I loved it. It was alive. Sometimes after class, I'd linger near the old art room where the windows let in golden light that looked like forgiveness. Mrs. Laird, my art teacher, once asked if I wanted to try painting again. I told her I didn't have the time. She smiled gently and said, "You're not supposed to have time for yourself. You're supposed to make it." I didn't answer her, but those words stayed with me. I started sketching again in secret. Nothing big, just pencil lines on notebook paper. Faces without eyes, hands reaching for something that wasn't there. I hid them under my mattress, far from the loose floorboard where my father had found my old journal. I couldn't risk that again. Every evening, I'd hear him come home. The jingle of his keys, the measured rhythm of his shoes on the wooden floor, the low hum of the TV as he sat down. Routine. Always routine. It was safety and suffocation all at once. One night, during dinner, he looked at me and said, "You've been quiet lately." I nodded. "I've been studying more." He smiled, pleased, proud even. "Good. You're learning what it means to be focused." I looked down at my plate, watching the steam rise from the mashed potatoes. Focus. That was his favorite word. For him, focus meant control. For me, it meant disappearing. The following week, we were assigned an essay in English class, Write about the person who has shaped your life the most. Everyone wrote about movie stars, teachers, friends. I wrote about my father. But I didn't write the truth. I wrote what he'd want to read. Words like discipline, strength, guidance. When I got the paper back, my teacher had written, "Powerful story, but I sense pain behind your words. Are you okay?" I stared at that comment for a long time. Pain behind my words. She was right. There was pain in everything I wrote. It just hid well. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what my teacher saw in me that my father never did. Maybe it wasn't her insight. It was just her permission to look. So I started writing again. Quietly. Carefully. I used old scrap paper, sometimes even the back of school handouts. Words came like ghosts. I want to breathe without earning it. I want to exist without explaining it. I want to be loved, not managed. Every word felt like defiance. But defiance has a cost. It happened one Saturday morning. He was cleaning the garage and I was helping him organize his tools. The radio played softly, one of those classic rock stations he liked. There was something almost peaceful about it, until he noticed the folded papers sticking out of my jacket pocket. "What's that?" I froze. "Just notes for school." He held out his hand. "Let me see." I hesitated for half a second too long. That was enough. He took them from me and unfolded them. His eyes moved over the words slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. "What is this supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. My throat was dry. He read out loud, "I want to be loved, not managed." Then he looked at me, his voice sharp. "So you think you're unloved?" "No." "Then what is this? Drama? You think life's a poem? A story?" I wanted to say yes, that life was a story, that we were all trapped in one of his making, but I didn't. He stepped closer, his eyes cold. "You're making yourself into a victim. Is that it?" My heart was pounding. I said quietly, "I just wrote how I feel." He laughed, short, cruel. "You feel too much. That's your problem." He tore the papers in half and threw them on the floor. "Real men don't write feelings. They fix them." Something inside me cracked. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just picked up the torn pieces and threw them in the trash. But that night, I sat awake until dawn, staring at my hands. They were trembling. It hit me then. How much of me belonged to him? My words, my thoughts, my silence, even my guilt. He had built me in his image, brick by brick, until there was no space left for who I might have been. In the morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He asked me to mow the lawn. I did. He asked me to wash the car. I did. But every motion felt mechanical, as if I was watching myself from a distance. That night, while my parents slept, I went to the garage. The smell of oil and metal hung heavy in the air. His belt, the same one he always wore, hung on a nail near the workbench. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. That belt wasn't just leather. It was memory. It was sound. It was the echo of every moment I'd been corrected, shaped, disciplined. I ran my fingers over it and felt my heart beat faster. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of becoming him. I put the belt down, slowly, and walked out. The night air was cold and alive. I could hear crickets,
the faint hum of streetlights, the world breathing beyond our walls. I didn't run away. I didn't rebel. I just stood there on the porch, realizing that the first act of freedom wasn't leaving, it was feeling. That realization changed everything. I started carrying a small notebook again, not hidden this time. I didn't flaunt it, but I didn't bury it either. I began writing about small things, the color of dusk, the way loneliness hums, the strange comfort of remembering pain. And though I knew he wouldn't understand, I started to hope that maybe, one day, I would.
I don't remember the exact moment I stopped trying to please him. It wasn't rebellion, it was exhaustion. Like holding your breath for years, then realizing the air was never going to change. By the time I turned 18, the house felt smaller. The walls seemed to lean in closer, as if they'd overheard too many secrets. My father still moved through every room like a silent ruler, calculating, composed, always expecting. My mother had learned to navigate him the way one learns to live in your fire. Careful steps, quiet voice, eyes lowered. I think she knew what was happening to me. Once, she came to my room while I was reading. She sat on the edge of the bed and said softly, "He wants you to be strong in his way. You just have to survive long enough to be strong in your own." Then she left before I could reply. That line lived in me. The winter of 1991 was harsh. Everything felt brittle. The trees, the air, my patience. College letters began arriving, each one like a crack in the system my father had built. He wanted me to stay close, study engineering, keep my feet on the ground. I wanted to leave. I didn't even care where, just away. When the acceptance letter came from a university 2 states over, I remember standing in the kitchen holding the envelope. My hands were shaking slightly. My mother's eyes lit up, but before she could speak, he said, "You're not going." It wasn't loud, just final. I felt something inside me fold in half. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. "Because I said so." That old phrase again, the anthem of control. I should have stayed quiet. I usually did, but something broke loose that day. "You said you wanted me to be disciplined. I worked for this. Isn't that what you wanted?" His jaw tightened. "Discipline doesn't mean defiance." "This isn't defiance," I said. "It's my life." He stepped closer. I could smell his aftershave. Sharp, clean, like judgment. "Your life," he repeated slowly, "exists because of mine. Don't ever forget that." The silence after that was thick enough to choke on. My mother stood in the doorway, eyes wide, hands trembling. He walked out without another word. That night, I heard him pacing in the hallway. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd gone too far. In our house, confrontation was treason, but I didn't feel guilty anymore. I just felt awake. Around midnight, he knocked on my door and entered without waiting. He was holding my notebook. "You still writing these?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He opened it, flipping through the pages. I watched his expression shift. First, confusion, then anger, then something darker. He stopped at one line I'd written the night before. "I don't hate him. I just wish he'd see me." He looked up at me. "You think I don't see you?" His voice cracked slightly, not with emotion, but with disbelief. "Everything I've done, every rule, every correction, it's for your good." "For your good?" I said. "Or for yours?" He blinked, stunned by the question. "You're my son." "I know. That's why I tried so hard to be perfect." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or memory. but it vanished as quickly as it came. He tore a page from the notebook, crumpled it in his hand, and said, "You're being dramatic. You'll understand when you're a father." Then he left. The next morning, the house was quiet again. He acted normal. Coffee, newspaper, radio humming softly. But I could feel the air around him, dense, unsettled, like he was holding back a storm. Later that day, while he was in the garage, I heard a loud crash, metal against concrete, then a sharp grunt of pain. I ran to see what happened. He was on one knee, holding his shoulder. The shelves behind him toppled over, tools scattered everywhere. I moved to help him. "You okay?" He looked up at me, breathing hard. "Leave it," I said, "leave it." But I didn't. I reached for his arm anyway. And in that moment, just for a second, I saw something raw in his face. Vulnerability, not power, not anger, just a man, tired and frightened of losing control. He pushed me away gently and sat down. He said, "I used to think being feared meant being respected, but fear doesn't last, it just changes shape." I didn't know what to say. I stood there, waiting for the familiar lecture, the command, the correction, but it never came. For the first time, he looked small. A week later, I left for college. He didn't come to the station. My mother hugged me, like she was apologizing for something she couldn't fix. When the train started moving, I looked out the window and saw our house fading in the distance. The same windows, the same garden, the same silence. But something had changed. I wasn't carrying the fear anymore, only the echo of it. Years passed. I visited less often. Phone calls turned brief and predictable. Updates, formalities, questions that meant nothing. Then one winter evening, long after I had started my own life in another city, the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was trembling. "He's gone," she said. "Heart attack." It was quick. I didn't speak. I just listened to the sound of her breathing on the other end. When I arrived home the next morning, the house looked smaller than I remembered. I walked into the living room, the same scent of wood polish, the same ticking clock, everything frozen in time. His chair still faced the television, neat, deliberate. On the coffee table lay a single folded piece of paper. My name was written on it. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "I tried to make you strong the only way I knew how. If I failed, I hope you find a gentler way. Your father." I stood there for a long time, the note trembling in my hands. There were no tears, just a strange warmth, like forgiveness arriving too late. That night I found myself in the garage again. The same faint smell of oil and rain, the same workbench. His belt still hung on the nail. But this time, I didn't see it as a weapon. I saw it as a symbol, a piece of history, worn and fragile, a reminder that perfection had its price, and we'd both paid it. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it in a box with his note. Then I locked the garage door and walked out into the cold night. The moonlight spilled across the yard, silver and still. Somewhere, a train horn echoed in the distance, fading into silence. For the first time, I didn't feel his voice in my head, just my own. And it was enough.